So I'm a fan of Abraham Maslow, a psychologist that wrote in 1943, I think it was, his paper that outlines motivation as a hierarchy of needs. It's a fabulous piece of work. It has stood up the test of time. I've actually seen it in about every leadership textbook for all the leadership classes I've taken. I actually started teaching at a university, and it was in chapter 2 of the textbook again. And I thought, wow, this has really become like it's canonized into the material these days of motivation and leadership. It's become a norm in our conversation around what this is. Who is this Maslow guy? We all talk about it like we all know who he is at some level, but who is he actually? And I went back and I bought his original work, and enjoyed it thoroughly. It was interesting. In it, it's not a very large paper, and it seemed to have been written near the beginning of his career. And he talks about all the different levels of all the different needs, physiological needs, safety needs, social needs, esteem, and then self-actualization. He makes this interesting comment that really took my breath away a bit. In it, now this is the 40s, which is in some ways not that long ago at all, like just a couple generations ago. I was actually trained as a leader in business by people who were children of his contemporaries. That's how recent it is. In it, he says about self-actualization. So he's talking about what that is, the idea of being able to show up as the highest and the best version of yourself. And in it, he says, we have not, now I'm paraphrasing here, so I might get this a little wrong, but he said, we have not produced a society capable of really understanding what self-actualization is. And then it appears as though he went on a journey to explore it and try to figure out what that was. And there's a series of books that are collections of his essays and speeches where he played with this idea and he studied this idea, even in his own life, trying to figure out, how do you self-actualize? Who are self-actualizers? What do they behave like and look like? And at the end of his career, he had developed some conclusions about that. One of them was that they were people capable of having what he called peak experiences. It's actually one of the last books he wrote was about peak experiences. And it's an empirical study of many religious practices. He said that we've relegated this idea of peak experiences or self-actualization to the spiritual space. And as scientists, they stayed away from it. They thought it wasn't their domain. And so he started to study it. And it's interesting, though, to have a psychologist, an atheist, a humanist. He was very influential in the humanistic movement, which was really on the march during this period of time, to go and study using the scientific method religious practices. They were happening, have been happening all over the globe in all forms for as long as we know. So he started to study them. And he said, we've got to understand what this is if we want to understand what self-actualization is. So I opened up a new book of his that I'm just starting to work my way through. This is it here. Oh, it's backwards, but you'll get it. And again, it's another collection of his writings that he was putting together at the very end of his life. And he actually died before he got it finished. So they released it anyway. But a gentleman named Henry Geiger wrote the introduction. And he touches on this idea of peak experiences again. And I found it fascinating to hear his summation of Maslow's perspective. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of it. He says, the climax of self-actualization is the peak experience. A peak experience is a coming into the realization that what ought to be is. In a way that requires no longing, suggests no straining to make it so. It tells human beings something about themselves and about the world that is the same truth, and that becomes the pivot of value and an ordering of principle for the hierarchy of meaning. It is the merging of subject and object, involving no loss of subjectivity, but what seems its infinite extension. It is individuality freed of isolation. I read that and I thought, holy smoke, that's a beautiful description of spirituality in my mind. That is something, that is a way of describing where our attempts at moral codes sort of intersect with reality, the merging of what ought to be with the is. I don't know if I've experienced that. It's the ability for, here, I'll read this again. It tells human beings something about themselves and about the world that is the same truth. The unity, the oneness, the all belonging. I mean, mystics have been teaching that for thousands of years, I think. And then he said, it is the merging of subject and object, where we're no longer seeing each other in terms of objects and categories and labels. We actually merge all that into a connection that is cohesive, I guess, involving no loss of subjectivity, but what seems its infinite extension. It is individuality freed of isolation. I can't read that any other way, but well, I suppose I could read it a variety of ways, but the way I choose to read it is that he's describing transcendence. Transcendence that is inclusive. It's the extension into this bigness that doesn't lose the smallness. We don't lose individuality, but we are no longer isolated. I just thought that that was some really beautiful language describing this thing Maslow called peak experiences. And I don't know if I'm extending this too far or past where the author would want me to take it. But as I read that, I thought it's just such a beautiful description of spirituality and journeys that go beyond our knowing, journeys that require belief to emerge. And how does an atheist get there? And then I wondered, actually, in some way, maybe you have to journey through atheism to be able to see spirituality. Anyway, some thoughts so far on Maslow.